Let's see. Our first session is on digital cartography, which I'll moderate, and another one on design in cartography, which will be moderated by my partner in crime at the Stanford Geospatial Center, David Medeiros. I'm most excited about these sessions because as a teacher, I try to leave people always with something useful as they walk away from our sessions. Try to leave them with skills. And I think all of you will leave here ready to use some of the tools you'll be presented today. So let's get started with our first session on digital cartography. We have three speakers today: Elspeth Iralu, Mamata Kela, and Mel Imfeld. We'll begin with Elspeth. Elspeth Iralu is an assistant professor of Indigenous planning at the University of New Mexico, a 2022-2023 postdoctoral Mellon Fellow at Stanford University. Her work has been supported by the Mellon Foundation, the Russell J. and Dorothy S. Bilinski Foundation, and the Naga American Foundation. Iralu's research in Indigenous studies, critical geography, and transitional American studies centers Indigenous geographies and examines how everyday militarism enacted through enacted transnationally shapes global colonial relations. Her writing has appeared in American Quarterly, The New Americanist, and Antipode, a journal of radical geography, and she is a member of the Editorial Collective of ACME, an international journal for critical geographies. Elspeth's talk this morning illuminates the idea that contemporary colonial control of Indigenous lands in the United States requires a severing of aerial, surficial, and subterranean spaces. Rights to subterranean minerals, oils, gas, and water function differently from territorial rights on the surface of the earth. And unlike nation states, Indigenous nations are not recognized as having sovereignty over their airspace. While the aerial perspective is used to monitor and collect data about Indigenous territories, the colonial state sees Indigenous sovereignty as permanently grounded. In her talk, Elspeth will explore the Indigenous video game Thunderbird Strike as a challenge to colonial perspectives on land sovereignty, which often separate rights to air, surface, and subsurface. Through the game's design, players experience an interconnected view of these vertical spaces, disrupting traditional colonial ways of monitoring and dividing Indigenous territories. The game serves as a digital representation of Indigenous worldviews, emphasizing the inseparability of air, land, and subsurface. Elspeth's talk this morning is titled The Land, the Water, the Sky, Volumetric Sovereignty and Indigenous Visual Culture. Please join me in welcoming Elspeth Iralu.
Thanks, everyone. I'm really happy to be here with all of you. And I'm really grateful to all the organizers and presenters. I've learned a lot from all of you so far. As you said, my name is Elspeth Iralu. I'm Angami Naga from the Mayase clan of Konoma village. Konoma is in Nagaland, which is an Indigenous territory that's cross-cut by India and Myanmar. But today I'm going to be speaking about an Indigenous territory that's a lot closer to home here in North America. As a former GIS technician who now studies the politics of Indigenous mapping, I was really honored to be invited to participate in this conference, but I was also, I'm going to admit, a little amused to be invited to participate in a conversation with technical experts on data visualization, as much of my scholarship is about how Indigenous peoples decide what data should not be visualized, why people decide not to visualize that data, and how Indigenous peoples go about mapping their territories when they want to protect certain data from visualization. So in other words, my research is concerned with the limitations and potential dangers of data visualization for Indigenous nations. And I ground this critique of the visualization of spatial data in a world of complex, beautiful, interpretive, and sometimes even technical approaches to representing spatial data that illuminate Indigenous territories for some people at certain times for specific purposes. So for example, I've written about the Zuni Map Art project, which comes from Zuni Pueblo, which I see as really an unparalleled model of how to communicate spatial information within one community while protecting it from co-optation by others. I draw heavily in my work on Indigenous data, in my scholarship on work in Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous visual sovereignty. Scholarship on data sovereignty tends to be quite technically focused on questions like the who, what, where and when, for collecting data, or how data will be stored, under what kinds of restrictions, and who will have access to it. And this research often is carried out by social scientists and sometimes by natural scientists. Scholarship on visual sovereignty tends to engage with Indigenous art and cultural production, like film and performance art or visual art, to examine how Indigenous cultural production asserts Indigenous life, presence, and sovereignty. And so this work is often coming from the humanities. My current work is concerned with the relationship between these two forms of sovereign assertion. So rather than seeing data sovereignty and visual sovereignty as discrete questions and objects of analysis that come from different disciplinary concerns or constraints, or as merely linked through privileging sovereignty, I'm really concerned with how visual cultural production makes spatial claims that we tend to think can only be made by more dominant and often more quantitative forms of spatial data. So to give you a little context, if you're unfamiliar with this field, Indigenous mappers and scholars of Indigenous cartography assert that Indigenous peoples have always made maps, and there's a rich body of work on the many ways Indigenous peoples have created maps, both through visual representation as well as through things like sound and performance. So I draw a lot on scholars and thinkers like Jim Enote, Mashana Goman, Nachi Blue Barnd, and Laura Harjo, who spoke at this conference a couple years ago. In the early 2000s, there was a movement of scholarship that was concerned with using the implications of using GIS in Indigenous communities, both for Indigenous GI scientists working with, in, and for Native nations, as well as for non-Indigenous GI scientists who are concerned about the ethics of mapping on Native lands. And so this body of literature is rightly preoccupied not only with the potential risks and benefits of using these technical approaches for land management, direction of emergency services, or historical record keeping, but it also repeatedly comes up against the imperfection of these tools to fully represent Indigenous lands as they're understood and known by Indigenous peoples. So in particular, scholars at this time called attention to the impossibility of representing Indigenous ways of knowing in, for example, quantitative data sets in a GIS. Within this scholarship on Indigenous GI science, there's one issue that comes up repeatedly, which is how to represent the depth and volume of Indigenous space and place. And when I say depth and volume, I mean this quite literally, about the volume of territory. So this issue of the volume of Indigenous territory appeared in work by scholars like Renee Polani-Lewis and Margaret Wickens-Pierce, who used tools available within kind of geospatial technological tools to represent Hawaiian landscapes in ways that more closely resemble Native Hawaiian ways of understanding these landscapes. So Lewis and Pierce describe shifting to the oblique view to better capture an embodied experience of the landscape that emphasizes the importance of cliffs and ocean to a person's experience of that landscape. While geospatial technologies have proliferated and advanced quickly since this early work in Indigenous GI science, the essential questions raised about mapping Indigenous territories remain, and I'm kind of boiling these down into two big questions. First, how can Indigenous mappers ground visual representations of Indigenous territories in a community's distinct ways of knowing? And second, what political relationships are exposed in these visual representations of Indigenous territories? So what I want to share with you today picks up these questions, taking Indigenous cultural production seriously as visualizations of spatial data that explicitly communicate Indigenous ways of knowing and political relations to land. And I pick up on this early Indigenous GI science question of representing territorial volume, and then I want to consider what political claims these representations make. And this analysis in this talk is part of a chapter in my current book project that's on the politics of Indigenous mapping. So I want to start with this question. How is the subterranean theorized in Indigenous cartography? I want to turn our attention to the subterranean as a political project and as a site of struggle that's revealed through Indigenous visualizations of Indigenous land. Colonial law severs the subterranean from the surface, making each zone distinct and therefore able to be claimed, sold, or surveilled separately from the others. This distinction is so naturalized within the law as to shape popular understandings of the relationship between the subterranean and the surface. In my analysis, I want to demonstrate how the subterranean functions as a site of political struggle for Indigenous territorial claims. It's also a site of epistemological and ontological contestation in which Indigenous peoples assert understandings of human relation to land that aren't necessarily comprehensible within colonial legal logics, and they're often not legible within dominant practices of data visualization. This is a geologic map from the Rumsey collection, and what I really want to draw your attention to is kind of two things. First, that geologic maps are one form of kind of normative map forms where we're trying to represent what is below the surface in this 2D form. And then if you look up in the Great Lakes region, you can see that there are some sort of magenta circles, and those represent traps where liquids like water and gas could be contained. So this idea of separating the subterranean and the surface legally is called free entry. So free entry, a principle that shapes subsurface rights to minerals, oil, and gas, allows prospectors and companies to explore for minerals and stake a mineral claim on an area of subsurface and obtain subsurface property rights without necessarily informing the neighboring property owners. While Indigenous nations must produce data providing evidence of historic land use in order to make socio-historic land claims, the free entry principle means that corporations' claims to subsurface mineral rights are seen as legitimate, even if they're just sort of potential discoveries. The free entry principle is enabled in the US, Canada, and Mexico by governance systems that make a distinction between property surface rights and subterranean rights. So prospectors and companies have claimed subsurface rights without seeking the consent of peoples with historical connections to those lands. In the US, the General Mining Law of 1872 authorizes development of mining projects of locatable minerals on public lands by private individuals and stipulates that the subsurface property rights may be purchased, even while the surface remains public. The geographer Bruce Braun examines 19th century mining rights politics in Canada to show how geological, and in particular stratigraphic ways of seeing territory, led to a colonial understanding of territory as vertical. However, rather than seeing the surface and subterranean as co-constitutive, this colonial understanding of territory's verticality meant a severing of the surface and the subterranean, so they could be claimed, owned, and sold separately from one another. Altamirano Jimenez describes how the Mexican Constitution upheld the Iberian division between surface and subsurface ownership. Quote, "While the state claimed the subsoil, Indigenous peoples maintained full ownership of the surface," unquote. And so this stood in contradistinction to Zapotec understandings of territory in which the subsurface represents the roots of plants, mountains, water, and other aspects of life, and is therefore intimately tied to the surface. Attention to the subterranean is also really crucial for Indigenous peoples in the US and Canada who are making certain kinds of political, legal, and territorial claims. In these cases, what lies beneath the surface of the earth is historical sedimentation documenting Indigenous claims. And so what's beneath the surface is quite literally what came before. So what I'm going to share with you today is an Indigenous landscape representation that makes a claim to the subterranean as Indigenous space. The video game Thunderbird Strike exposes the tools that enable subterranean colonial extraction. Created by Anishinaabe and Métis scholar and artist Elizabeth LaPensée, Thunderbird Strike features a Thunderbird who protects the Great Lakes waterways from the Enbridge Line 5 oil pipeline, which is the brown lines on the screen. The player is the Thunderbird, collecting lightning by flying through clouds and striking objects on and below the surface of the earth. Striking can destroy pipeline materials and machinery and can simultaneously bring life to other objects on the screen, for example, reanimating the remains of caribou and buffalo. Unlike the aerial or oblique perspectives common in first-person shooter games, Thunderbird Strike is a 2D side-scrolling game, marked by a cross-sectional view that allows the player to see what is above, on, and below the surface of the earth, reminiscent of geologic cross-sections that indicate stratigraphic layering. In this way, the imagery connects what is below the surface, pipelines, animal remains, water, to what is on the surface, excavators, herds of caribou, and sign-carrying water protectors. The game's made up of 3 levels. In level 1, the player begins in the Alberta tar sands. The cross-sectional landscape is dotted on and below the Earth's surface with infrastructure and machinery used to extract oil from the tar sands, both surface or open pit mining, as well as in situ mining through steam-assisted gravity drainage. The Thunderbird flies through the clouds to collect lightning, then navigates down to strike. When the Thunderbird successfully strikes a piece of extractive equipment or infrastructure, referred to in the game as a fatal strike, the machinery bursts into flames and disappears, gaining the player destruction points. When the Thunderbird strikes animal remains under the surface, they are reanimated as an animal above the surface, similar to those already there, except with a slight glimmer of blue around the reanimated animals. This is called activation, and it earns the player restoration points. The Thunderbird can also strike animals that are already on the surface, earning neutral points. At the end of each level, the game plays the player's destruction, restoration, and neutral points, as well as a total score comprised of points earned in all three categories. Players may choose what type of points to earn or emphasize, and it's not necessary to earn a particular type of point in order to move to the next level. In Level 2, the Thunderbird flies over the Saskatchewan prairies. Level 2 functions like Level 1. There's oil infrastructure and machinery and vertebrate remains below the surface, which the Thunderbird strikes to earn destruction or restoration points. In this level, there are semi-trucks carrying pipelines that move across the surface, and parts of pipelines are emplaced underground. Humans walk along the surface of the earth, holding signs with protest slogans. In this case, it's images of a snake. Level 3 takes place in the Straits of Mackinac, which connects Lake Huron and Lake Michigan. Now the Thunderbird flies through the clouds above the Great Lakes. A large black snake appears on the left side of the screen, jointed like pipes with the pipe fittings visible in regular lengths along its body. The snake's head is in the clouds at the level of the Thunderbird, and its body weaves as it spits out large gray rocks that the Thunderbird must strike in order to stop them from polluting the lakes. Early in Level 3, a small leak of black oil begins to seep out of one of the pipe joints. The oil disperses and spreads over the course of the game. By the time the game ends, the water of the Great Lakes has changed color from a light turquoise green to a dark green-black. Upon its release in 2017, the game was met with a vocal backlash, as oil lobbyists and a state legislator attempted not only to shut down the game, but proposed new legislation that would closely regulate state grant funding for artistic projects. In October 2017, Minnesota State Senator David Osmek stood before the Minnesota State Legislature and called for a drastic reworking of state grant programs for art and environmental projects, citing a state grant of $3,290 for the development of this Indigenous video game, Thunderbird Strike. Senator Osmek stated, "When the legacy amendment to our Constitution was approved, no voter could have imagined that our taxpayer dollars would be used to fund video games that blow up pipelines. Minnesota taxpayers expect their money to be invested in Minnesota, not in funding an eco-terrorist version of Angry Birds." For these lobbyists and legislators, the two-dimensional world of Thunderbird Strike posed a greater threat to life than any of the dangers of oil production or transportation. By their representation, the video game's Thunderbird became an aerial insurgent, instigating eco-terrorism and attempting to twist gameplay into violence against the state. LePensée, the game creator, situates this video game in relation to Gerald Visner's theorization of survivance, beyond survival to a, quote, nourishing of indigenous ways of knowing, unquote. While the lobbyists and legislators see the Thunderbird and the game itself as a technological attack by insurgents, for LePensée, the Thunderbird, clouds, and fauna reanimated through lightning strikes gesture towards a future in which indigenous ways of knowing and being can flourish. In Thunderbird Strike, the player as Thunderbird flies both horizontally and vertically, cross-cutting the boundaries between air, surface, and underground, gathering energy in the clouds and releasing it as targeted hits on and below the surface. In its navigation of the horizontal and vertical, as well as its facility for precision hits, the Thunderbird is reminiscent of drones used in everything from warfare to hobby photography. Recent scholarship on surveillance of indigenous movements pays particular attention to the drone and its use for surveillance as well as counter-surveillance, surveillance, and territorial self-representation. For both surveillance and counter-surveillance, the drone is favored for its ability to blend in and be almost unnoticeable, It can capture wide angles and physically zoom in for a close-up image. The operator of the drone could be close by or operating the drone remotely. It's protected from any assault on the drone and can even remain anonymous. And the images collected by drones can be shared quickly and seamlessly, making evidence public that can affirm or contradict dominant narratives. Horizontal and vertical navigation of a drone doesn't necessarily have to replicate kind of dominant ways of knowing and seeing land. Indigenous counter-surveillance via drone extends the contestation over Indigenous territories from the surface into airspace. And this was seen in the movement against the Dakota Access Pipeline, where there are a lot of drones that were both used for policing and counter-surveillance of the police, but also for representing landscapes and taking a large number of photos of the landscape or where the pipeline would be placed. So the use of these drones allowed water protectors in this movement to claim airspace, reference landmarks, mark places of significance to local tribes, and represent the landscape according to Indigenous sacred and political practices. What I want to highlight here is the sovereign insistence to represent Indigenous territory on Indigenous peoples' terms in ways that challenge dominant modes of representing territory. The Thunderbird in this game operates not just as an insurgent, as the Minnesota representative saw the bird, but in fact as a sovereign itself, surveying and navigating Indigenous lands in ways that affirm how Indigenous peoples understand their own lands. Simply crossing the vertical boundaries that are assumed to be impassable within the legal spatial framework of the US offers a visualization of Indigenous ways of knowing and relations to land. In this way, the game effectively foregrounds cultural ways of knowing of land and depth in a way that isn't really replicated within more normative technical mapping tools. In Thunderbird Strike, a pipeline creates a transect across a continent, crossing nation-state borders as well as the lands of Indigenous peoples. In this visualization, the pipeline cuts through a rich landscape, populated by people, animals, flora, where even animal remains shape a living presence within and on the land. This visualization denaturalizes the pipeline as inevitable, belonging, or unseen, and it makes visible violence on the land that is usually literally buried out of sight. The cross-sectional view highlights the connections between subterranean, surface, and sky, and simultaneously centers the political implications of the aerial perspective for mapping Indigenous lands. The Thunderbird reminds the player of the omniscient aerial view and simultaneously subverts that perspective as it crosses the vertical boundaries between air, surface, and subterranean. Perhaps what can't be seen through the aerial perspective offers greater potential than simply indigenizing of the aerial. Leponce's play with the cross-sectional view of the Thunderbird's flight takes on this tension, generating an image from a perspective that can't be achieved through drone, aerial photograph, or remote sensing, and can't even be seen with the human eye. Though acting as the Thunderbird, the player can see a vertical display of everything happening above, on, and below the surface of the Earth, a perspective more expansive than the aerial perspective can claim to be. Thunderbird Strike attempts to make the remote intimate, linking subterranean and surface not only through the visible imposition of machinery, but also through the act of unearthing and reanimating remains. Rather than simply offering a window into another's experience, this digital project engages in a world-making vision where the intimacy of spatialized colonial violence is not only exposed, but challenged. Thanks.